You're looking a little sluggish this morning, so I thought, you know what, a little sugar, a little crank it up a little bit will be good to go. So just you know, I hold true to my words, right? You sit close to the front, you may get stuff. So if you haven't been with us for the last couple of weeks, we have been doing a series around forgiveness. And when I thought of this series, and I thought of kind of the word that I would attach to it, the word I continued to come back to was the word wrestling. This idea of wrestling with forgiveness. Because I'm sure for all of us, we come to a place of recognizing the concept of forgiveness, of understanding the importance of forgiveness, wanting forgiveness, but the hard part is in living it out, is in seeing it become a day-to-day reality in our lives. And so that's why I think in many ways, forgiveness is something that we continue to wrestle with in the midst of all of life. But when you think of forgiveness, it's important to understand that forgiveness is at the heart of what God is all about. That God desires relationships. First and foremost, our relationship with Him. And then secondly, our relationship with others around us. And we know that because of the world we live in, because of the mistakes that have been made, because of the brokenness, that relationships at times don't go according to plan. Our relationship with God, and then as a result, too often, our relationships with other people. And so the question we always want to come back to is, how do we start to repair these relationships? How do we make these relationships right again in the midst of things that go wrong? And so 2 weeks ago, if you were here, we looked at the first step. And the first step, the most important step, I believe, is in understanding first and foremost how we have been forgiven by God. I mean, that's the reality of the cross. That's the display of what God has done for us. He didn't simply speak about the importance of love. He didn't simply speak about the necessity of forgiveness. He showed it in the actions He took, in coming through Jesus, in giving His life, in paying the cost, even though it was completely undeserved. God took the initial step to say, I will show you my love for you. Now, it didn't remove all the consequences. It didn't remove all the brokenness in the midst of the world, but we understand and know that ultimately when we receive this gift, we can be forgiven by God. And I think it starts there because if we don't understand how much God has forgiven us, it's going to make it incredibly difficult. I would say almost even perhaps impossible to begin to forgive those who have wronged us. And so that took us into the second step in understanding, well, forgiveness is not just simply a dynamic and a reality that happens between us and God, but that it is then to flow into every other relationship that we have. If you notice in the Bible, whenever it's spoken of forgiveness, forgiveness is always a response to what God has already done for us. And so in the same way that we have been forgiven, we are called to forgive those around us. So this morning, I want to take it a further step because it's been interesting in terms of my conversations with different people, whether in person, whether on the phone, whether in email. There's so many questions, there's so many issues, there's so many dynamics at play when we talk about forgiveness. You know, there are those surface hurts, those things that we can kind of quickly move on and get over. But then there are those deep hurts where perhaps our trust has been betrayed. Perhaps we have been wronged in such an indescribable way that we start to really wrestle with the reality of, okay, how do we forgive? What does forgiveness truly mean? And I want to focus a little bit on understanding that forgiveness goes beyond just the initial act of forgiving the offender or the offense. That when we make a choice, and I believe forgiveness is a choice, there's going to be ripple effects to that choice and that decision. And I want to focus on two fairly significant ones here this morning. Because one of the things that may be problematic is if we think we can just separate the issue and think, well, I won't forgive or I will forgive, whatever your choice is this morning, and then think it is over and it is done with. And I would like to suggest that it actually goes beyond that. Think of it for a moment if you have a stone or a pebble in your hand and you drop it into a bowl of water or into a lake or whatever. You drop the stone. That is the initial action, and it makes a plunge. But then what happens? Because of that dropping of the stone, there are then ripples that then begin to go further and further and further out. I would suggest that the very same thing is true when it comes to either forgiving or not forgiving. That may be the initial choice or decision. That may be the initial rock drop. But that there are then going to be ripple effects in our lives and in the lives of others. And so at least just for us to begin to consider and to understand just what this is all about. That there is more at stake than just the initial offense. And that's why forgiveness is a wrestling. That's why forgiveness goes deep. That's why forgiveness is at the heart of what God wants for us, because it goes beyond just our initial response. And so to help us out this morning, we're going to turn to a place in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 12. It's near the end of the Bible. If you have your phone or your device and you want to swipe there, feel free. We're going to put it up on the screens. If you want to follow along in the Bibles in the pews, it's on page 227. I'm going to just read from a different translation on the screens here this morning, but I think it's a very pointed conversation, just 2 verses, that really begins to unpack for us the ripple effects of forgiveness. And so we read these words. It says, "Make every effort to live in peace with all men, with all people, and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." I think that's a very appropriate couple of verses when we think of forgiveness. I just appreciate that first line, the opening line. It says, make every effort to live at peace with others. It's again that fact, it's again that reality that it's going to take some work. It's not going to come easy. And so whenever we think of, again, we spoke about last week, forgiveness is just forgive and forget, just move on. No, it's not that. There is concerted effort when it comes to forgiveness. There is significant intentionality when it comes to forgiving others. And so we need to make every effort to live at peace and to be holy. It goes on to say, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Now holiness is not about, in this context, about being perfect. Holiness is the understanding that when you are set apart for the purpose of God. Set apart for the purpose of God. And so do you begin to see and understand that forgiveness is actually God's desire for us in our lives? That it is one of the ways that we begin to step into, what does God want for me in my life? So often when we think of that question, when we ask, what does God want for me in my life? You may think of occupation. You may think of the person you're going to marry. You may think of specific decisions in terms of where you're going to move. A list could go on and on and on. But do you understand that the primary purpose that God has for you is not just in what you do, but in who you're becoming? And forgiveness is a big part of that. That we are set apart for a purpose, that God wants us to be holy, to follow in His ways. And so what are the 2 ripple effects of forgiveness? Beyond just that initial relationship being restored, I believe the first one is seen in these words. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. People are window shopping for Jesus. People want to see the reality of what God means to us in our lives. Jesus, when he gave his kind of final words to his disciples in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, after Jesus hung out with his followers for just over a month, as he was ascending back up into heaven, he said these words, listen, you're going to be my witnesses. Essentially saying, you're going to continue and carry out the work that I have begun. And so, if we speak of a God of love, if we speak of a God who shows forgiveness, if we speak of a God who treats us not according to what we deserve, but what we need, is that same reality lived out in our lives? You know, we just sang a song here this morning. I have to look at it here to see what the words were again. But they'll know we are Christians by our love, right? We'll know we are Christians by our love. It's a great song. It's a catchy song. But is it just sentiment? When we speak of love, what is it that we're truly speaking of? Like, what is the reality of the love that is lived out in our lives? You know, the Bible is saying how you behave, how you treat others, your willingness or unwillingness to show forgiveness or not, is not only going to be a direct reflection on you, but also upon God. And so do we see that our actions and the choices that we make in many ways has an impact upon what others will see? Not what we say, but in others, what they see. Now, as I talked about last week, forgiveness is not about saying, you know what, it's okay, it didn't matter. No, it doesn't say that. Forgiveness also doesn't say that it removes the consequences of someone's actions, but what forgiveness does say is I am going to bear the cost. I am going to make the initiative. Not because I necessarily want to, but because I want the reality of God to be something more than just a song that I sing or words that I say. That it begins to take root in us. I think one of the dangers we fall into is thinking that forgiveness is going to be an emotion that one day we experience. We behave as a result of what it is that we believe. If we believe at the core that God wants us to forgive, that this is an opportunity to extend grace into people's lives, will we take that step? Will we see our actions of forgiving others as an opportunity to show others the grace of God? There's no point in having the conversation as to whether it's deserved or not. It's an opportunity to extend the grace of God, because then perhaps that person will acknowledge it, but perhaps then others will see it as well and say, I cannot believe they responded in that way. It just blows my mind. And then the only explanation is, it's the grace of God at work in my life to extend in the lives of others. And so I think one of the first ripple effects of forgiveness beyond the initial act is that it gives us an opportunity to truly show the grace of God at work. But there's a second one. And so that would be a benefit for others. But there's also a benefit, a ripple effect in our own lives as well. As the Bible goes on to say, see to it that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and to defile many. I think it's important to understand that forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness is a reality where we continue to come back to the circumstance and the situation, and we are giving it back over to God. You see, sometimes some of the dangers in running into forgiveness is we just think, we'll just kind of sort this out, we'll move on and we'll get right again. And we think that we have forgiven, but we have not. And I love the image that the Bible gives to us. See to it that no bitter root grows up. You know, I've said many times, I'm not a gardener, but I understand kind of the basics of weeds and flowers and plants and stuff. It's what you see above the surface is only a fraction of what's happening underneath. And I think a lot of the times we may trick ourselves, we may get ourselves into a place of thinking, well, I've forgiven, I've moved on, it's okay, it's no big deal. And if we haven't actually gone through the process of working through forgiveness, bitterness begins to take root. You see, think of it in a physical sense. If you were to cut your arm, if you were to hurt yourself, you know, you acknowledge that you have been cut, but you don't just simply say, you know what, it's no big deal, it'll sort itself out, you know, time will heal. What? No, if you don't deal with the initial hurt and the initial wound, what's going to happen? Infection, disease, and then suddenly it's going to spread into other parts of your body just because you failed to acknowledge what was really going on. And so when you start to tend to the wound, when you bandage it, when you stitch it, maybe you take antibiotics for it, whatever, you acknowledge the fact that you need to deal with this so that there will not be greater consequences further down the line. And I think the very same thing is true when we choose not to forgive. Say, for example, someone breaks your trust. Someone has done it in an incredibly hurtful way. Now you can say, okay, I'm just going to move on. I'm never going to really trust that person again. But I would suggest that if you fail to truly begin to internally forgive that person, even though that relationship may never be restored to the place it once was, if we don't do the hard work of forgiving in that moment and for that person, I would wager a bet that the lack of trust that you've experienced with that person is going to begin to be transferred into other relationships as well. Where suddenly you don't let yourself get too close because you've been hurt in the past. Suddenly you don't engage in certain ways because there's a residue of what hasn't been dealt with in the past. You see, there's really two ways to deal with weeds in your garden, right? Dandelions, we all love dandelions. Our kids love them because they're bright and yellow and flowery, but when you're trying to get a green grass, it's not so helpful. There's really two ways to deal with dandelions. There's the quick and easy way, and you can just get rid of them all real quick. Get out the weed whipper and just go to work. But everyone knows this is a bad idea, right? Because you may take care of them for the day or the week, but then those blasted things come back and they invite their friends. The next thing you know, there's like a dandelion party on your lawn. But it's quick and easy, right? We'll just move on. We'll just deal with it. We'll just move on. And I think sometimes that's what we may do when we don't truly go through the process of forgiveness. Then there's this other contraption here. Not a whole lot of fun. Not real sexy. You can't put gasoline in it. You can't fire it up. You got to manually work this sucker, right? One at a time. You got to put it on the dandelion. You got to turn the dandelion. You got to pull the dandelion and repeat. And when you look out and you see all these other dandelions and their friends, you're thinking, where are my kids? I'll give them like a quarter a dandelion or something, right? It takes work. It takes effort. It takes time. It sometimes may seem like you're not changing it at all. But the difference between this and that is it gets at the root. It makes sure that it pulls it out so that one will not come back to cause greater problems. I kind of think that's a good image for forgiveness. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes work. But it does work. You see, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 says these interesting words. And he's talking to other Christians in the city of Corinth about the importance of forgiving. And in 2 Corinthians, in his letter to them, in verse 10, he speaks about the importance of forgiving. So much so that you need to understand the context too, right? I mean, the early church was facing severe persecution. They were being wrongfully treated over and over and over again because of their faith in Jesus. And so they would have a lot of opportunities to either forgive or not forgive. And this is what Paul says to them, the leader trying to pave the way. He says, anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. For what I have forgiven, if there's anything that needs to be forgiven, it's for the sake of the presence of Christ. And then he says this interesting line. He says, we do this so that we may not be outwitted by Satan, so that we are not ignorant of his schemes. I think Paul is hitting on something fairly significant here. He understands the power of a failure to forgive. You see, if God is all about restored relationships, then I believe Satan is about ruining relationships, first and foremost with God, and then secondly with others. Now, I don't know where you stand on Satan and the work in this world, and we may disagree, but I think one thing that he is not, he's not like the boogeyman who hangs out in your closet, right? Waiting to kind of jump out and scare you and put a great deal of fright and fear. He's a crafty individual who schemes in different ways. And if we have been hurt, he wants us to hold that hurt. He wants us to own that hurt so that we will not release that hurt and in order and allow ourselves to experience forgiveness in the lives of others. Now again, I'm not saying this is an overnight process, but it's a reality that we begin to say, is this what I want in my life? Do I understand what is at stake? Not just from the initial act of forgiving, but that there's going to be ripple effects. It's going to impact my life. And so this is a process that I need to begin. Maybe it's not even a place where you want to go right now, but to understand the importance and the significance of it. Jesus says to us, I have come so that you may have the abundant life, a life truly worth living. Now, our understanding of forgiveness and getting right with God is not just about us going to heaven. It's not just about what happens to us when we die. Yes, that is a piece. It's about living right now. And God does not want us to hold on to hurt that then turns into bitterness and can begin to impact us and the lives of those around us. He wants us to have the abundant life. And one of the ways that works is through an understanding how we have been forgiven and how we are called to forgive. Not always the simplest of things. So a couple of things for you to consider here this week. In the back of your bulletin, just a quote to think about from Martin Luther King Jr. It says, forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a constant attitude. It's a decision to say, this is going to be a part and a reality of my life. And so two things I would encourage you to do. If you want forgiveness to be more a part of your life, first is to read Psalm 32. Great reminder, great words of just how we have been forgiven by God. And then turn your attention to Matthew 5, particularly verse 44. When Jesus says these words, he says, pray for those who persecute you. pray for them. And so is there someone in your life? Is there a situation in your life that you need healing in? I would suggest bringing it before God. Bringing it honestly before God. Don't say what you think he needs to hear. God can handle our rants. And sometimes that's what prayer is. It's a rant to God. It's a saying, I don't want to, but I think I need to. And you know what God does? He takes our hurt. He takes our anger. He takes our rants. And he begins to transform them. And he begins to transform us. And he begins to remove the bitterness and the hurt in our life. But we got to make an effort. And that's why we're reminded this morning, make every effort to live at peace. Because there is something at stake in your life and in the lives of others. Let us just pray together. And what I'm going to do is just pray on behalf of all of us. But if there's a specific person or a specific situation that you need to bring before God, I'm not asking you to feel all lovey-dovey in your heart, just to honestly bring that person before them and say, God, I can't deal with this on my own. I need you. I need you. Let us pray together.